Welcome everyone to the On the Spectrum podcast. I am Nick.
I'm Steve.
And as always, when we start the episode, me and Steve do not presume to be experts in anything for any reason whatsoever. We're just two human beings who happen to be on the spectrum and having conversations with things that either affect us, people on the spectrum and or just things we care about talking about. In this episode, you will hear potentially some language that you may or may not like. You might hear some topics you may or may not like. We might talk about some taboo things, some controversial things, and or we might use some language you don't agree with. If this is the case and you do not agree with some of the things that you hear, please leave us a comment. Reach out to us on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok and let us know that you like or dislike something we said or did.
Yeah. So today I wanted to talk about I guess I don't really have an easy way of phrasing it, but I wanted to talk about morality. I wanted to talk about devil's advocate, people playing devil's advocate, and understanding your own capacity to do bad things and putting yourself in other people's shoes. Maybe those seem unrelated, but it makes sense in my head that those are all connected.
And we're going to talk about word usage of things too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that ties in.
But, yeah, it does.
I guess if you were to sum it all up and the way those things are connected, it's about how we judge other people and how we judge ourselves. It's about understanding yourself as well as your ability to understand other people. And one of the things that I've learned as I've gotten older is that you can't always just write things off as well, that could never happen to me, or I could never do that. If you see somebody do something terrible and you think that, well, I would never do that. You think about, do people who are in the KKK, do people who are neo-Nazis think that they're bad people? I would say that most of them probably don't think that they're bad people because they have reasons why they've justified the beliefs that most of us think are abhorrent and that we think are bad.
But isn't the perspective of good and bad, isn't that in itself like subjective to the person themselves?
Well, what you're talking about, I think, is like moral relativism.
Sure.
It's kind of like how people will say, all right, so in our country, we're much more accepting of gay people, but in some countries they kill people if they find out that they've committed, if they've had gay sex,
like Nigeria.
Right. I'm not saying that our systems are morally equivalent, but that's the argument is that, well, in their culture, it's okay because, it's morally subjective. They've decided that it's morally inappropriate or it's morally wrong to be gay. We've decided in our country, for the most part, that it's not morally wrong to be gay. Well, some people might disagree with that.
Some people.
But at least to the point where we're not, even people who are anti-gay probably still wouldn't most of them probably don't actually believe in hurting or killing gay people for being gay. They just,
maybe.
I would say your average conservative, even if they're not super into like homosexuality, is not going to be like, yeah, let's go kill the gays.
Maybe not openly. No, what I meant by that though was like, and I've always explained it, at least what you're talking about. I've always thought of it and looked at it from the sense of like freedom fighter terrorist. Yeah. From that kind of dichotomy, like if you're a freedom fighter, if somebody agrees with you and on your side, or you're a terrorist, if somebody doesn't agree with your whatever reasoning you have.
It's kind of like people flip the Star Wars script and say that the rebels were the bad ones because they were disrupting the peace.
Right.
Because the Emperor actually brought about peace in the galaxy.
I'm completely down for the dark side. Yeah.
But
That's why I voted for Thanos twice. Not that those two universes have anything to do with anything, but
I guess my point is that people like to think that they're better than other people, especially when you're looking at it through the lens of history. If you look at atrocities or terrible things that have happened in the past, you like to think that, well, if I lived in Nazi Germany, I wouldn't have gone along with that. But most people would. Most people, they convince themselves that they would be the one person to stand up and do something about it. But most people are too cowardly to actually do anything.
Well, like when you look back on things, absolutely. I mean, if we look back on it from nowadays standpoint, most people would say, well, I wouldn't do it. But it's not like Hitler took power and one day said, hey, everybody, kill your neighbor. Like there was actually a systematic process that they went through to get to the point where a lot of, and not everybody in Germany, but a lot of people kind of went along with it.
Right, but that's an extreme example.
Yes.
is Nazism. Like that's the extreme. I mean, you could also say the same thing with like some of the stuff that happened in the Soviet Union and some of those other, but we don't have to go to the big scale things like that. We can talk about everyday things. You know, people making judgments about people who are homeless, people making judgments about people who are drug addicts, people making judgments about people in our own country, people on the opposite political spectrum, people with extreme ideological beliefs. People are unwilling to not only try to put themselves in other people's shoes, which is why I mentioned the devil's advocate thing, because I think that even though people find it annoying, I think there's some utility in trying to understand and be able to argue the other sides, or argue, you know.
You also said put somebody in somebody else's shoes, with it, which is usually the euphemism people use for empathy.
Yeah, like I don't have to agree with it. Like if I think that
just because you can empathize with somebody doesn't mean you agree with them.
Right. So for instance, like here's one that's very difficult for most people. Trying to understand what it would be like to be a pedophile. Assuming that it's not a choice, assuming that it's something that something wrong with your brain, right? Trying to actually understand what it would be like to be that person. That doesn't mean that it's any excuse for abusing a child. But like having any level of empathy for that, most people don't have the capacity to do that because of because of what's associated with it. It's so bad and abhorrent and disgusting to people that they're unwilling to even think about what it's like to be any of those people who do these terrible things.
But if you think about the several levels that it takes to empathize with another human being, for one, most people think if you can empathize with somebody, then you agree with them on some level. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And I kind of think that's what you're saying too. But a lot of people believe that if you can empathize with somebody, then you agree with them. And that's not necessarily true. But as well as when you're talking about empathizing or even playing devil's advocate, right? You have to understand their point of view to a degree to play devil's advocate for their side. And a lot of people would believe that if you can understand in some way that other person's point of view, then there must be a part of you that agrees with them. And that's not necessarily true.
Well, I think it's for me, I would go down the path of what would it take for me to be like that? So it would be if I was to be like, if I was somebody who ended up in the KKK, like if I was somebody like that,
right?
What would it take for me to get there? Okay, maybe I was raised around people who believe this. Maybe I haven't had a lot of experience with people of color. Maybe I've lived in a small, poor white community, and it's easy for my family to blame other people for our situation in life and our problems. I'm saying there's a lot of different things you can walk down. If that's all you know, right?
Well, hold on. I'm going to pause you real quick right where you are, because I don't want to stray too far from what you're talking about, but I got to side note the shit out of this. How come every time people talk about the KKK or racist people or Aryan Brotherhood or just in general like white racist folk, how come people always describe them as being from a small town and having no experience around somebody? How come it can't be like a racist white guy from like the inner city who's been victimized a lot?
Well, because specifically the KKK is mostly people from small rural communities.
That we know of, or at least that's the stereotype. Do you think there's not somebody in New York who lives in the middle of New York who's not like a flag-carrying member?
Maybe not flag-carrying, but...
Okay. Do they have a flag?
Well, I'm saying, okay, because they actually have... We know that there are like active groups, right?
Yes, there are.
Those active groups are
yes.
majorly in rural communities.
Well, that we know of, but like racism exists everywhere, good sir.
I'm saying that we don't know of like underground KKK brotherhoods hiding out in the middle of New York City. Okay?
Right, there could be,
but from the reason why there's a stereotype of it's rural people is because those are the government, the FBI watches these groups.
I know they do. I know they do. The reason why I'm saying that is because the average person looks at a racist as being just that. And unfortunately, that stereotype, there's a lot of people who actually match that stereotype who are also not racist.
I know, but that's besides the point.
Well, the reason why I'm sidestepping to the side is because like we always describe racism as being people who are unfamiliar with a different race or different culture. And there is also something to be said of if somebody is victimized by somebody who is of a certain demographic, they are more likely to dislike that demographic and have ill feeling towards others of that demographic.
Israel and Palestine?
Sure. Yeah, let's go with that.
Well, I'm just saying because, a lot of
you mean all
people,
their wars and stuff?
Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians will be like, oh, you got to watch out for those Jewish communities. They're going to treat you bad. And the same thing with the Jewish side. Like, oh, you can't go in there. It's dangerous to go to the Palestinian areas because they're going to. But the reality is most of the people there probably don't really give a shit.
Could be, yeah.
At least that's what I've heard is that
so
they'll like warn you about going to certain areas, but like most average people don't really care that much.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up is just because to perpetuate certain stereotypes, creates a belief that all people with that similar background are of that way, and that's not completely true. But also, we're not looking at everything that could potentially create that level of hate and disdain for somebody.
I understand that, but that was I was just using that as an example.
I know. It's always bothered me when people use that example because that's how they describe racist.
That is something that I would also think about if depending on the group. So, for instance, like trying to understand people. It's not that as big anymore, but like when the alt-right thing was a big movement for a while, trying to understand those people, right? Because they don't necessarily fit into those boxes of those people you would necessarily.
In fact, none of them really fit that all
so
that well.
Trying to understand, like, it's more so trying to understand either like the train of logic. How do you reason? Because as I said before, people don't think that they're evil. People don't think themselves as being bad typically.
No.
So where do you? I'm saying bad.
Yeah. Just keep going with your statement. I was going to throw.
I'm saying we generally think that racism is a bad thing. I think racism is a bad thing. So
we do. We do. When we sit on this side of it.
If you are X person, or if we think the alt-right is most of us might agree that the alt-right is probably a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's morally relative but that's part also what I'm saying is they don't think they're bad.
Well, of course,
but other people think they're bad. But I'm saying it's not even whether it's bad or good, because it could be a good thing too. Let's say that I think that being a leftist is a good thing. Let's say I think that's good. Okay. Or you could think it's bad. That's not the point. Right. The point is, how do you get to that? How do you become possessed by that ideology? How do you get to that point?
So that was kind of where I was going with that side note on that, is because we look at, and our conceptualization is just somebody who is ignorant.
Yeah.
Somebody who has no reference to, unfamiliar with, right?
Right. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
But maybe it's not. And like in the case of, Breitbart guy, what was his name?
Breitbart guy?
Yeah. Alt-right newspaper, owned it.
Andrew Breitbart?
No. He worked for Trump's presidency.
You're talking about the guy who took over after Breitbart died.
Sure.
So Andrew Breitbart started Breitbart, and then there was the other guy, the fat guy. I don't remember his name.
What's his name?
I don't know.
Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
Steve Bannon is his name. And he doesn't match any of the way you described somebody's racist, right? Now, Granted, I don't actually know if the dude is, right? Because I don't live in his head. I don't read minds. I just know that some of the things he has said and published, not the best frame of mind right there. But the reason why
I would argue that maybe if you're trying to profit off of racism, that might make you racist, even if you're not.
See, I wouldn't.
Maybe if you don't have personal racist thoughts or beliefs, like maybe he doesn't feel that way. But if you're making money off of people by selling, like you're making money off of people's xenophobia and people's fears and people's racism, then I think that makes you racist, even if you don't believe racist things.
I don't know if I'd agree with that it automatically makes you racist just because you're making money off of somebody else's fear. Because in that regard, making money off of somebody else's fear, that's a lot of things in capitalism, my good sir. That's a lot of companies make money off of people's fear. A lot of companies. And it's not just like racist, hateful fear, but.
So I guess.
Just saying.
One of the things I wanted to bring up, it's indirectly related to the topic, but it's something that's been bothering me is I see all the time, and you know that I've bitched about social media before and about how like social media is great. The internet's great. I've always been a huge tech nerd. I love a lot of stuff. I used to sell cell phones for a long time. Love technology. I think it's great. But I don't think people focus enough, and I think I mentioned this on another episode. I don't think people focus on the negative parts of it enough, like a lot of the downsides to being like being able to access information as easily as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the downsides to social media, like having access to us, like you're connected to this stuff 24/7.
Okay.
One of the negative things is you have people out there who share their opinion, who have a big audience, who don't necessarily take the time or do the due diligence or don't care to because they're just feeding into their audience.
Mm-hmm.
There's something called, I think it's called audience capture is the phenomenon, is what they call it.
Okay.
So for instance, if I am a Tucker Carlson type person,
Right.
and let's say I have a podcast and I'm a right-wing podcast and all I do is talk about right-wing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Audience capture is basically where you get to a point where your audience determines what you say, what you do, and your viewpoints. So you're not even yourself anymore. You're bound by your audience. So let's say I have an opinion that doesn't go along with what the right-wing correct opinion should be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't share that opinion because my audience is not going to like it.
Well, but I mean, isn't that just a good way to keep your show going?
It is, can be, but you're not being honest. And what happens is you have people who will purposely mislead. And it happens with mainstream media, but it happens a lot with alternative media too, if you want to use those terms.
Yeah.
Mainstream media, alternative media.
Yeah.
Mainstream being like, CNN, Fox, all that stuff. And alternative media being like all the smaller news shows and podcasts and stuff online.
Where Tucker Carlson is now?
Yeah, whatever he's doing.
Yeah,
now.
whatever.
I think he was supposed to be doing a Twitter show or something.
Yeah, something like that.
But what happens is something will. Sorry, because I went off a little bit. What I was trying to talk about is there'll be a story or something that breaks. People will see. They'll get a little bit of information. It could be.
They'll read just the headline.
Well, it could. Well, not even that. It could just be a short article because we don't have all the information. Or a lot of times there's a video or something or a photo. People will see a couple photos or a video, a short, let's say 1 minute video. And let's say there's an altercation or something that happened. And this was something that happened over the course of hours or an hour. But you're seeing a couple minutes.
Right.
And either that 1 minute has been purposely edited to only show you the parts that they want you to see.
Right. Or
it was just 1 minute uncut, but it's only a small part of what happened. You don't have the full context. And what drives me insane is that everybody does this. People will have a reaction and make some sort of judgment based on that small thing.
Right. Well,
which is normal human.
Conclusions based on very little information.
And make a bunch of assumptions, draw conclusions.
Right.
My problem is that you also have people who have these large audiences, who have a lot of influence, who will spout these opinions as fact or as though they're so sure based on that small amount of information. And then now you have not only that person saying that, but now their audience is also reacting to it. And you end up with situations where their lives could be endangered. They'll lose their job.
Yeah. Because
you have a mob essentially coming after them over something that may or may not even be true. Mm-hmm. And that's what I have a problem with. I think it's disgusting, and I think it's a problem.
It's a problem, but it's human. Like, and I don't want it to defend anybody who distributes misinformation on any news organization, but it's human to make snap judgments. It is human to hear a couple of pieces of information and then automatically draw a conclusion.
It's irresponsible and stupid.
That's human.
If you're especially yes, a lot of people do that, but if you need to be held to a higher standard. If you're somebody who has a huge audience, you need to wait for more information. You can't just
who needs to be held to this standard?
I'm saying, if you're talking about how you would enforce something like that, I don't.
No, I don't. I mean, like in your estimation, in this discussion, in this topic, who needs to be held accountable to that?
It's more of a personal thing. I think anybody who has a large audience and who talks about news, politics, anything like that.
Give me a number to work with here, because I would like to say some things on it, but I need to know how you would deem that.
Anybody who has a large audience. So if you have like 2 million subscribers,
great,
on YouTube, if you have millions of followers on a podcast, if you're a larger channel like that. So people on YouTube who have millions of followers, there's channels like, I'll talk about a couple, Majority Report, Sam Cedar. Sure. There's Destiny's a streamer that I listen to. Yes. There's Steven Crowder, who I don't know, whatever he's doing. Yeah, people like that. Ben Shapiro. His name is. What's another one? The Young Turks. Yep. It's like a left-wing show. Any of those people who are talking about stuff, obviously they're going to have their bias because they're left or right or whatever. But they should not be making a bunch of assumptions and then feeding it to their audience as though this is true. And I can give you a specific example. Hold on, before you give me that example. But all of these people you just named off, they believe they have enough information to move forward with it. So that's part of the problem is when you have to be aware. You have to be aware that there's a problem. You have to be aware that, hey, I only have 1 minute of video to go off of. I can't. But they all know that there's a problem because they blame each other. Because you'll even see these people walk back sometimes. They'll say something, and then once they realize they're wrong, they'll walk it back or come up with some excuse as to why they made that. Well, so there was a streamer who has a rather large audience, and there was a video that came out. People were making judgments about it. And he said, well, this person should be fired. Yes. And a lot of people said that. And the person in the video ended up actually losing their job over the video that turned out to be false. Because people were making judgments off of a short video clip without context. So the reason why I asked about the specification of who should be held responsible to it is because, unfortunately, again, it's a human reaction to make snap judgments based on very little information, right? Humans just do it. We all do it. I mean, we've all passed judgment on somebody with very little information. But with the world we live in now, with the social media access that we all have, with all of us believing that our opinion is important somehow, you're going to have a lot of that. And there's no real way to control it. There's no way to hold people accountable to it. No, we need to make people aware of what they're doing. But they already know what's happening. Ben Shapiro knows full well he might not have all the information possible. I don't know about Steven Crowder. He seems like he's just a shock jock kind of guy who's just getting attention. I don't know him personally. Well, no, but he also will lie and omit things. I mean, technically, everybody omits. What I'm talking about is not just the lying and omitting. I'm more specifically talking about when people make the assumptions when they don't have all the information. So, like, when somebody watches, you can know you don't have all the information if you see a video that's 1 minute and it starts in the middle of an altercation that's already happening and it ends before the altercation's done. So how can you possibly think that you have all the information you need? Well, like the auditor people on TikTok, like most of the time you don't get to see what led up to when they're talking to the police officers. They're just immediately already talking to them in the video, and the video ends before there's a resolution. It's the same thing there because you don't know what's going on. A lot of police videos, that's part of the problem too, is you don't have full context. Right. So it could be that the person, there's some instances where even if, it's hard to explain, but the context matters even if the police officer is still wrong. Yes. So if the police officer does something that's bad, that thing might be bad regardless of the other context, but the other context can put it in perspective because, for instance, there was an incident where this cop ended up, I think, pulling his firearm on somebody, and the original clip didn't show that the guy was running around with a knife or something like that. Okay. And so you can judge the cop's actions or whatever that situation was, but people were reacting to it without knowing that the guy had pulled out a knife and was without the full context. Right. So were the cop's actions wrong? Maybe. Depending on what happens, especially if someone ends up being killed. But if you have the full context, it makes a little more sense. So let's take what we're talking about, putting things in context, and let's try to apply this to like people's everyday lives. In this regard, like when it comes to interactions that we have day to day with people, and more specifically, when us neurodiverse folk have conversations with NT people, what
how can we kind of help ourselves from this? Because we are prone to having black and white thinking.
Right. And this is actually probably why I've focused on it so much, is because I used to do the same thing.
Yes.
And I used to fall into this trap quite a bit of jumping on the bandwagon one way or the other, or having these strong opinions.
Right.
And then it took me a while of the reflection and listening to other people who shared their opinion.
Right.
Kind of some of the ideas that I'm sharing with you now.
Yeah.
Other people, I listened to other people who started pointing out like, hey, we don't have enough information. And I had to train myself not to do that. I had to train myself to actually stop and try to consider, what don't I know?
Right.
Because there's so many different possibilities. There's a lot of things that could explain, if you see something or you hear about something. And you have to also keep in mind, like we were talking about with your wife about I think you were there when I was talking to her about that guy the homeless guy who got choked out on the subway, who died, Marine, put him in a chokehold.
Oh yeah, you did tell me about it.
So, like, I think that, from what I understand, allegedly the guy choked him for 15 minutes. So I think, regardless of the context, he probably shouldn't have choked the guy that long. That's probably why he died.
Probably, yeah.
However, with the way it was being reported, people didn't know that he was threatening people. So, like, omitting that information puts a different context on the situation.
Well, because somebody decided to arbitrarily decide what was important and what was not important in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree that choking somebody out for 15 minutes, bad juju pretty much no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And somebody omitted that first part. But it
because you want to tell a certain story.
Right, because they want to tell a certain story. But I think in this regard, the reason why it's kind of relatable to us being on the spectrum is because a lot of the times we have tendency to judge the actions of an NT, and we almost always judge that action based on the way we would think about something, even though we're striving to hope that somebody else, an NT, if you will, is going to give us understanding, but we don't necessarily extend that same level of understanding out. We don't frame the context as well.
I mean, it's something that I've been trying to do and
trying to
get
make
better
that relatable to the podcast.
No, it is. That's true.
Yeah.
But that's another reason why I've been trying to get better at that kind of stuff. So I had a tendency to fall into. I was one of those people on the spectrum. I fell into the stereotype of falling into like one extreme ideology after another.
Right.
So I went through a period in my early 20s where I was like this huge ideological left-wing person who was like anti-Bush and all this stuff. And I went through all these different periods where I was following into these different ideologies, but I was like, I felt so strongly about whatever I was into at the time.
And then you swang all the way on the other side of that pendulum.
I mean, I was more right-wing for a while.
Yeah, and now you're settling in the middle somewhere.
Well, I ended up finding that the commonalities between, like, when I was jumping all over the place ideologically, there were certain constants there, and those constants were my real opinions. And I realized that I'm mostly, like, I don't really adhere to any political party in particular, but my views are pretty much libertarian, meaning like...
Or at least closer to it, yeah.
Yeah, just like, hey, leave people alone. Yeah. That's my general thing is, like, government and states, like, we should just let people do what they want. Let the gays do what they want to do.
Right.
Let people own guns. Let people do drugs. I don't give a shit. Just people do whatever they want. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
I mean, I really, like, you're like, whatever. Let people do whatever the fuck they want. I don't care. As long as they don't bother me.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to go smoke weed in your house.
I will say that for myself, because you're talking about, like, adhering to really strong ideologies at one point or another and having different ideologies. I had an old friend a very long time ago, not a person who I'm going to call by name because I don't care for this person very much anymore. But at one point in my life, this was a person who was kind of influential to me. And they always said, never make assumptions. And they kind of drilled it into me to never assume. Now, I know now, okay, this was like 20-something years ago that the person kind of drilled that into me of not making assumptions. But at this point in my life, I understand that, you can't not make an assumption about things. It's just kind of how human beings are wired to begin with. We assume things up front. We draw conclusions up front. But he always said, don't make assumptions. Don't assume anything about anything. And that kind of always stuck with me. So, like, when I've seen all of these, like, 1 minute, 2 minute videos, whether it be police harassing somebody or a law enforcement officer in an interaction with somebody, or it's any other video I've ever seen, there's always a part of me that goes, and there's got to be more to that, right? So anytime somebody tells me a story about how like somebody treated them poorly, I always say to myself, there's more to that, right? Kind of like a certain situation we know of somebody recently where they were banned from a casino. I knew full well, even when I got like the briefest version of that story, I knew there was more to that story. Okay. I knew there was more to that story. And there probably still is more that I don't know. But that's why I kind of like, even when we have conversations and you believe very strongly that I'm wrong about whatever it is, and you just think I don't have enough information, there's always a part of me there's got to be more to it. So I try not to immediately go on that gut reaction in my head and jump to whatever that conclusion is. So, to kind of counterpoint what you said, you were very strong into certain ideologies for periods of time.
Well, I've
never been strong in any ideology.
Black and white thinking, I think I got.
Yes.
I went down different rabbit holes. I think when I talked about this in the political episode.
I hate that expression.
Well, in the political episode, that's what I talked about. Is like I would fall down into these. Because I would
fucking expression.
Well, the internet makes it worse because of the way that I talked about that in the political episode too, about the echo chambers and stuff. So when you start looking at something, they give you more of what you're looking into because they're like, oh, this is what you want to see.
Right.
So if you start looking into right-wing stuff, it's easy to consume all this right-wing material because that's all they're showing you now.
And that's how you became best friends with Ben Shapiro.
Yeah.
Got it.
My algorithm's confused because
yes, it is.
Mine, I'll get Sam Cedar, Destiny, and Ben Shapiro in the same feed. I'll get because they're completely different on the opposite ends of the spectrum, but I get all these different mixed because I watch people from all over the place for different opinions.
Yeah. Hey, question for you, and this is just kind of off topic, but not really. Do you look at a lot of political stuff when you're on our TikTok?
No.
Do you ever go on our TikTok?
Only to post stuff. But okay. No.
Because for some reason
I tagged Matt Walsh in one of them because I was making fun of him.
Okay, maybe that's why then. It's just when I'm scrolling through it to try to find videos or just kind of find topics or whatnot, there's a whole lot of even further extreme right stuff.
No, I don't.
Way further than Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, way over there. There's this one guy with a beard who just
I don't know.
He's almost as close to as KKK Grand Wizard as I can possibly fathom there is.
Matt Walsh is just an idiot.
Well, yes, agreed.
Because it's not even he doesn't know what he talks about things that he doesn't know anything about.
Really?
Which, a lot of people do who are into politics. They have opinions on things that they know nothing about.
I think humans have tendency to do that.
So there was a good example of this. He went on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Oh.
And they were talking about his documentary, What is a Woman?
I'm sorry, what?
He had Matt Walsh.
Matt Walsh made a documentary
with the Daily Wire called What is a Woman? And he was talking about his podcast with Joe Rogan. And Matt Walsh was saying that he thought that there were millions of kids in the U.S. on hormone replacement therapy.
Okay. Please pause. Matt Walsh.
Yeah.
One of the whitest people on the planet who has glasses, a pseudo junior Hitler haircut, a little beard, well-groomed beard. He made a movie called What is a Woman?
Yes.
I'm assuming a documentary.
It's about trend.
Yeah, I get the point, but
he went around and asked a bunch of people who are gender studies professors and people who are doctors who give kids puberty blockers and stuff like that. He went around asking them questions about it. And then he had this gotcha question, which is, what is a woman? And then he waited for them to give some stupid answer, so in his, it is cringy to watch how people answer the question. So I'll give him that.
Can you please say something other than cringy?
Cringe?
You're not 24.
Okay, it is cringy, but okay, they sound ridiculous.
Thank you.
With some of the answers they give. So
soon you're going to start saying things are ick, and that's not cool.
So I personally think that a lot of the anti-trans stuff is bullshit, and I have no problem with. I don't think that we should be trying to restrict people's access to hormones and all that stuff. I don't care. I personally have but I want to see people who are trans be able to live their best life and all that stuff. I do think it's funny though, like I was saying.
Yeah.
So like, I don't agree with Matt Walsh's opinions on things, but
Right.
it is really, when you hear the way people talk about it, like some of the people who are a little far on the edge there.
Yes.
They're a little kooky.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Some of the stuff they say.
Although I will say, and I'm not trying to defend Matt Walsh's position by any fucking
Am I getting
means.
us in trouble right now?
There was there was the God, I don't even realize, I don't even know 100% what it was. There was, I think it was a Senate committee meeting, and they were questioning this woman, and somebody said, "What is a woman?" And the woman just kept like basically obfuscating the entire.
Well, that's why people are asking that, because of Matt Walsh's documentary.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, nobody should copy that documentary.
The problem was like,
but I mean, this was an official like Senate hearing kind of meeting thing, and this dude just kept saying
it's not politically correct if you're on the left wing of the aisle to give an answer that, because they feel like if you give the like the textbook
the traditional answer
of what a woman is, then that's somehow letting the cons get a win, you know.
Okay.
Because it's like you're giving into the Republicans, it's stupid,
which means
like
it's political theater on the way.
Right. So that's one of the things I talked about before in the political episode is how like people will focus on issues that aren't important, or you feel like just because like people feel like they have to. We talked about when I was mentioning people who do podcasts, so they do these news shows or political shows. You feel like you have to go with whatever the party line is. So it's not popular if you're on the left to talk about gender in a certain way, because that's not politically correct and that's not what we're supposed to say. Right. But it's funny because there's certain times when conservatives look stupid, and there are certain times when people on the left look stupid because they're purposely trying so hard not to say things a certain way because they don't want to give into what the right wing.
Right, they don't want to ostracize anything, nor do they don't want to give an ounce to anybody, in whatever. But I think that's part of the problem with the conversation about all of these topics, and especially with trans. Like, even if they gave an answer that gave some definition of one way or another, regardless of what that definition is, how does that change that a human being is being affected?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't change that. And so, like, but then you have it on the other side of that, right? By removing certain definitions, by taking away the identifier of some way, right? You're also making things confusing in a different way, right? Yeah. And so both sides are basically just trying to one-up one another, opposed to trying to find a solution that fits. Find a way to make it work.
Right.
Right? Like, I will say the woman who's being questioned, and actually I only assume it's a woman, but the person who was being questioned by that male senator tried her damnedest to get around every which way possible, saying some shit.
Or it's like,
but ultimately she kind of tripped over her own words, not giving any definition of what a woman is, but tripping over her own words, because she tried so hard to avoid saying it that there was only one conclusion left, which was that she believed a woman was whatever this senator was, saying. Would you describe this as a woman? What I will say with that too is, every time I've heard somebody question somebody about what is a woman, why don't they ask what is a female? Like, why do they always say woman?
Because
like, I thought woman was the social construct.
It's weird because so it's another thing that I've been questioning myself on a lot lately is language.
Yes,
and
I do it constantly for myself,
because I used to be a lot like you, where I was very particular about. I'm still am pedantic, but pedantic when it came specific. I'm pedantic about many things, but I'm being less pedantic when it comes to language.
I'm still pedantic about language.
You have to understand that just because like words are just a tool, right, for us to communicate with each other.
Right.
Words change over time. We give definition to words that are in the dictionary. We use words a certain way. The way we use them and their definitions change over time. And also, people who don't look like you may use different words that you may not consider proper.
See, that's why I'm putting a finger up and saying, hold on just a second. Because yes, words change, but if you decide a newer, modified, evolved definition is what you're going to use, but I'm still using the old definition, then neither one of us are speaking the same language.
Right, but that happens.
But that becomes, hold on, but that becomes a problem because if your belief is that words are always going to change, then how do you have a conversation with somebody?
Well, this is why it's important if you're having debates or if you disagree with somebody is to establish the terms and what you mean before you start actually arguing about the point. Because a lot of times people disagree and they don't actually disagree. They just disagree on the definition of what they're talking about.
But with that being said, that man in whatever that committee meeting, Senate meeting, whatever that was, that man was trying to get her to define so they could have a conversation on equal terms, but she wasn't willing to do so. So same thing, and I'd like to point this out, same thing when some people have no problem with the word disorder and other people say, nope, nope, nope. Or when some people say something is a mental illness and some people have a tendency to say it's mental health issues.
I was going to say,
sorry to throw extra pieces in that. It's just when people say, I actually find it to be a little bit of a cop-out. When people say, well, language changes. Well, you're only saying that because you're already adjusting the language to whatever that change is.
But it's a social contract because language changes naturally over time. It's socially accepted.
But currently we're changing language at a rate that very few people can keep up with.
It's like ain't. Used to be a slang term. It's now officially part of the dictionary because the dictionary doesn't tell us what words are proper and what we use. We use words as we speak to people, and they change over time. What you're talking about, I think, is people trying to force language to change in a way that's not natural. So, I think what you're saying is the difference between language naturally evolving over time versus people trying to assert that, no, this is what we're going to do now.
So what I mean by that, so even in our own world, even in the autism world, right, there's a large, I can't even say a large majority. I can't say the size of the population, but there's a group of folk in the autism community who think Asperger's syndrome needs to be gotten rid of because it has Nazi connotation, because it came from Hans Asperger from the Nazi time period, from World War II era. And we need to get rid of it. It's old, outdated, blah, 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 blah. But there are also people who say they want that because that's what they were diagnosed with, and that's how they want to identify. And those two groups of people keep saying, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. And I'd like to mention there's an age difference between those two groups of people.
Yeah, but they were ultimately still talking about the same thing.
Well, they're not, because some of the people who want to get rid of calling it Asperger's syndrome also don't like it being called high function. And some of those people even dislike it being called level 1. They want all of autism. Now, granted, these are folks who would fit into the formerly Aspie area. They're people who want just autism, right? But they're also the same people who are, I don't know if they're forgetting per se, or if they're just, purposely leaving out the entire section of autistic folk who actually need to have representation, who actually need help.
That this is something that will work itself out over time.
It's,
I think that... I think it will. I think that some people might still continue to use it, but I think over time it will go one way or the other.
Well, it's kind of like right now.
Or something else will come up with another term.
Well,
the example I was going to use is when people talk about racism.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people have different versions of what they think racism is.
They do.
And so people use the words.
Modified quite a lot in the last 20 years.
A lot of times when people talk about racism, there's disagreements going on because they're not actually talking about the same thing.
Right.
Because they're using the same word, but they don't. That's why I was saying if you have a disagreement or you're going to debate with somebody, I think it's important up front to define your terms. Yeah, what do you actually mean?
Nobody does that.
They do in debates.
Well,
I'm saying if you're having
debates.
A conversation with somebody, you might not. But it's important to try to understand what somebody means, not just the word you're using, because you and I can talk back and forth, and the conversation won't go anywhere. And we could be over here, but we're right here because we're still arguing over something that you and I might actually agree with. It's just because we're using we have different definitions of the word.
Well, kind of like the word bias and prejudice have seemed to have evaporated, completely gone from our vocabulary, from our vernacular, in most people's vernacular, and everything's just racist, right? When really there's bias and prejudice, right? And some people would say, well, they're the exact same thing. No, they're fucking not. There's a big difference between the three of them, right? And verbally, there might be similarities to them. Like when you hear somebody say something that sounds racist, it could actually be prejudice or bias, but it might be the same sentence. That's why I'm so hard up about definitions.
Well, I want to
because we forget about the other words that actually create a different level of severity, a different level of texture, if you will, to it.
I want to give a shout out.
Oh, okay.
To some Michelle.
Okay.
I know. You know.
No. I watch him on TikTok. I think he does a really great job explaining a whole lot of things.
Me giving him a shout out is not going to help him much at all because he has a lot of followers. But he was one of the people who made me start to question myself being pedantic about things when it comes to language, because I didn't understand a lot of the stuff he teaches.
Right.
I didn't understand why. Like I've never even heard of a lot of the things that he talks about, and I didn't know much about it. And a lot of that is probably because of, growing up in a small white town and all that stuff. But
you could have just said that. I mean, you pointed to your arm. You could have just said, because I'm fucking white.
But it's not that I ever it wasn't like I was looking down on people who spoke in a different dialect or slang, but it was like if somebody, I would do the thing you do. Like, that's not a word. Right. Or that's just slang, whatever. But there's actually a history to a lot of the words that are part of those cultures. People who speak in different parts of the country and they speak in different ways. Right. There's actually a history to the language and the terms and the phrases and things they use. It's not like they're just, so who decides what is and isn't proper? And that's kind of the thing, like where he talks about the origin of a lot of, Black American English. Yes. And where it comes from and the words and the history. And there's actually words that are from English that are in the Black American lexicon that have history in English that other people stopped using that Black Americans kept using. Right. And so there are actually variations or just old English words, which is interesting. I didn't know that stuff, but he made me start to question myself when it came to being pedantic about language. And so now I've started to just not care about that stuff anymore. Just if I understand what you mean, great. If I don't, then I'll ask so I can understand. And I don't really care as much about the specific words. I care about whether I understand what you mean or not.
And that's where I think, and by the way, real cool guy, you guys got to watch him or look at his TikToks. He is a very intelligent human being, especially when it comes to language and linguistics. I've learned a hell of a lot from him too. Some of my favorite parts of it, he talks about, language evolving, but he also talks about how the more it changes, the more it stays the same in a couple of episodes. There were specific things he was talking about. But anyway, real cool guy. And he always ends every episode with, "We out, Joe." And by the way, just with his tone of voice, it sounds cool as shit. I'm just saying. Anyway.
And he's a professor at Harvard.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Very intelligent guy. And he explains things really, really well. And I like how nothing he says sounds like he's talking down to somebody. Even when he puts up a post of somebody being real ignorant and he's disproving what they're saying, he's still not disrespectful or talking down to anybody in the process. Yeah. I like that. Anyway, I still get very pedantic about things and I still get very hard up about language about it, because if I'm trying to understand you, I need to know where the language, what you're saying, what it means, right? I need to know the definition you're using. And the downside is far too many people assume you know it or you're just willfully ignorant. And I think that's part of the issue, is the assumption of willful ignorance. To give an example, I was talking about autism with somebody on the Spectrum account, and I had to stop talking to them when they started to bring up things about autism that they thought were a part of autism. And I'm not going to say they are or they're not. It's just this person started bringing up things, traits and symptoms or symptomologies or whatever you want to call them, about it. And I kind of paused for a second, because I know all of what they brought up as humanistic things that humans just do, but they were saying it's because of autism. And I didn't want to necessarily argue because, it's our podcast together. So I wasn't going to argue on, my belief in that moment. It was just really interesting to me that they're trying to tell me about things that are autistic, or they're trying to say that these things are autism when they're human traits. They're human things. I know I'm kind of being a little vague, but just kind of on purpose, actually, because I don't necessarily want to have a debate with anybody else about it or whatnot. And it was just the assumption that these things are specific to autism, and they're not. They're very humanistic things. Most humans do them. And like in all of the time that I've spent, studying psychology or in psych classes or reading books and stuff, like all humans do this shit. But it was just a couple of things in particular that they were claiming was autistic things, right? That all autistics do. They actually specified and said all autistics do this. And I know full well that not all autistics do some of this stuff, right? Like my girl and my boy do not do that stuff. Neither one of them do either one of those things that the person pointed out. But it was just a matter of like, they were trying to define what they thought autism was. And it didn't quite match up to what I knew it to be, right? And part of the reason why is because we're two separate human beings. But it just kind of threw me off. You know what I mean? And so I do try to understand somebody else's definition, but it's the assumption that I should already know.
Have you ever heard of being confidently incorrect?
I'm usually confidently incorrect. I actually seem like I'm confident about everything I say, even though I'm not usually confident in it at all. One last thing I want to bring up, and I obviously do not presume to be an expert about anything. I said at the beginning of the podcast, when CIS came about and the usage of it, I saw a couple a couple of TikToks where it talked about how that has always been used.
That's been around for a scientific term.
So somebody brought that up. Somebody said that that's actually a scientific term, right? That's actually a scientific designation. I've never heard of it. Now, granted, there's a lot of things in this world I've never heard of.
But
like, I'd only recently started
taking like a scientific term and then using it in common
vernacular. Yeah. But like, I've only heard that term over maybe the last 15 years. Now, granted, I'm only 42. I haven't lived a super long period of time. And I'm not super inundated in the world of science when it comes to gender and things like that. I mean, I've read a couple of papers, no big deal. I'm not fucking expert in any of it. I don't do research psychology. I'm none of that jazz. But somebody pointed out that this is a term that's been around for a much longer period of time than that. And it kind of threw me off. Now, I wasn't talking to him. It was just a TikTok I watched. And it threw me off to think that this term that a lot of us only recently heard of has actually been around for a lot longer. Now, there's probably a lot of English words I've never heard of before. It was just this one in particular kind of threw me off when somebody said that it's been around a lot longer.
Yeah, but it would make sense that the term would be used more in a common vernacular or in common because of the fact that
it has been common vernacular.
Right, but the reason I'm saying it would make sense that it would become more common to use the word with how openly people were talking about transgenderism or being gender non-binary or all those people who are
you're absolutely right
who don't identify as cis. Right. So now it's a word with utility because it's a scientific word that already exists, and now you're using it with the utility to describe somebody who,
Okay, so I get you, and I'm trying to roll with it, by the way, because there are people who take it offensively being called cis, and I don't understand that part either. Like, if I'm cis, okay, fine, that's what I am. What exactly does it mean?
It means that you identify your sex and your gender align. So if you were born male and you identify as a male, then you would be cisgender. So if you were born with a penis and you consider your gender to be male, that means you're cisgender. So your gender aligns with the sex you were born.
Oh, all right.
So if you're a woman and...
So wait, then why does anybody have an offense to that?
I don't know. It just means if you were born female and you identify as a woman, then you're cisgender.
So basically, if you were born with a vagina and you accept the fact you have a vagina?
No.
Oh, my bad. Was that the ignorant way of saying it?
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
You identify with being a woman.
I just really
Because a lot of people would say that
in this episode, I'm the asshole.
I would say
really
that
like
a lot of people would say that you don't need a vagina to be a woman.
Well, no, I agree with that.
Because there are women with penises.
So, but I also very much agree with the fact that man and woman are social constructs. Male and female are scientific terms.
Right.
Which, if I'm wrong on that, anybody who's listening to this episode, if I'm wrong that male and female are scientific terms, please correct me. Because I'm open to learn new language. I'm open to it. Just give me a better way to describe it. Like I'm 42 and I act like an 80-year-old. So let's go.
I don't know how I somehow know more about this than you.
I know full well why you do. Because you're fucking like 6 years younger than me or some shit.
Yeah, but
because you're literally the generation below me. That's why. Because you actually grew up with some of these terms being a lot more accepted than I did.
I think what...
I mean, shit, I'm from a generation where we still called people FAG.
Yeah, I think...
derogatorily.
You mean motorcyclists?
Yes, I do. I mean motorcyclists, yes.
Yeah. I think... I understand why some people get irritated by some of the language around gender because...
Well, I don't... Now that I know exactly what cis means... Like,
no, I don't even mean that. I just mean like... going back to like the whole what is a woman type thing. It's that for most of our lives we used woman in a particular way, and then now you're including other people in the term woman that wouldn't have necessarily been considered woman in the past. So it's changing the way you use certain words, and I think that bothers people sometimes.
So here's a question for you, okay?
Yeah.
The traditional way to look at man and woman, right? I don't ever remember somebody describing man or woman as having genitalia at all. I remember people describing man as being a series of traits and behaviors that a man does. Same thing with a woman, right? I don't ever remember hearing somebody say, if you've got an outie, not an innie, you're a man. Right? Like, I don't remember that. I mean, I could be fucking wrong, but I don't remember that as part of the definition.
Well, it's okay. You'll never have to worry about being one. So.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
We're still trying to figure out what you are.
That is a true statement. That is a true statement. All of this is like a very, very interesting thing to me. Because for one, I'm kind of stuck in my own, right? My own definitions, my own, black and white thinking, my own rigidity in my thinking, right? At the same time, I've got pieces of me and parts of me and part of my thinking that is a little bit more progressive, if you will, when it comes to concepts of things, right? Because like if something's a social construct, to me, it's like, fuck, of course it's going to change, right? But if something is a rigid belief, a rigid fact, or I don't know, something other than a social construct, it's much harder for me to lean away from it. But I guess maybe that's part of the tism, maybe. And I'm not blaming the tism.
Yeah.
And also, can we lean into that a little bit about excuse and explanation? Or is that another episode time?
I would say maybe that's a talk for another time.
Yeah, let's talk for another episode. You got it, buddy.
We're at about an hour now.
Oh my goodness, we've hit the hour mark, everyone.
Yeah.
All right.
If you're listening this long, then you must be a better person than me.
That's true. Actually, Steve actually left like twice and then came back while I was talking.
Oh, yeah. The main takeaway from this for me was I like thinking about the idea of like putting myself in shoes and understanding my own capacity to do bad things. It's very interesting for me to think about that. Is like, what would I do if I was in this situation? Could I do something evil? And a lot of people don't go through that mental exercise.
I don't think I put a whole lot of thought into that, but I know full well I'm capable of evil.
A lot of people don't know that.
I know.
They think that they're better than that.
Well, they're silly.
And the other key takeaway for me from this episode was I really wanted to talk about how people just dogpile on shitty opinions without enough information. And you're just like assuming somebody's guilty of something, assuming the worst about somebody that you don't know, assuming you understand a situation that you know nothing about. It happens a lot. We talked about the police thing. I wasn't specifically thinking about that, but it does happen a lot with police situations one way or the other. It turns out the police were complete bags of shit, or it turns out the police maybe weren't as bad as you thought,
right?
Because you get more context.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking in general, you see all these videos that go viral all the time online.
Oh, yeah.
And they're like a minute long, 2 minutes long, and you have no idea what happened before and after. And people just want to assume things, and then there's pieces of shit on the internet who will harass these people's jobs and try to get them fired over something that they don't know anything about. You're not there. You weren't there. You didn't see it happen. You don't know anything about it. You're just assuming this person is a piece of shit, and you're being a piece of shit by calling their company and trying to get them fired because you think that they're a misogynist or a sexist or a racist or they're whatever.
Based on very little. And I will say that if you read a comment somebody made, and if that comment on some post doesn't explicitly say something fucking sexist, racist, or any of the phobias or any of the other hateful isms, if it doesn't specifically say one of those, don't assume, because that assumption and then you taking that assumption and going and trying to get them fired, their kids didn't write that comment.
I also think that
plus also if they work for a corporation, the corporation doesn't give a fuck.
It's another conversation to have is whether businesses should even be doing that to begin with.
No, I
is it really a business's place to help police social media or police online? If you work for a company, should they really be firing people for something that goes viral about them online? Or is that really their place?
I don't. You know what? That's a great episode to do at another time. You're absolutely right, sir. I would love to have that conversation.
Because I really don't think that necessarily a company should be doing that.
I don't agree with
I could understand why they might want to. They're worried about reputation and stuff like that. But especially where it's a situation where it turns out the person wasn't a bag of shit.
Yeah. Definitely good topic for another episode because I can fit that to autism a lot and how we would be affected by something like that.
Oh, you mean how I have been affected by it?
Yes, but how you have. Yes, I was trying not to actually say that. So, as always, as we say at the end of every episode, if you heard something in this episode that you like, you dislike, you want to argue with, you want to inform us about, you want to educate us about, whatever it may be, please go onto one of our social medias, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, I don't know, any of the others, because we have one for just about all of them. Go to any of them. Let us know what you think. Put some comments. Let us know. And if you would like to be on this podcast and you are a human being who has an opinion about autism or anything whatsoever and you want to be on this podcast, please reach out and let us know.
I also, before we end, I just want to let people know that unfortunately, if you're a fan of Nick, we're going to have to let him go soon. I'm looking for a new guest host because it turns out that my tincture works very well and he's no longer autistic. So him being cured, I didn't think about this ahead of time, but I actually shot myself in the foot because now I don't have a co-host. He can't be on the podcast if he's not autistic. So we're going to have to find someone else. So if you would like to guest host this show, co-host, guest host, special guest, whatever you want to do, but I might need a new co-host. So
wow. 9 episodes in a row, huh? All right.